The experience of original nature is experiences of timelessness, of selflessness. It helps us distinguish between the self and consciousness. When people are in these sorts of states whereby they feel one with the great unity, if you reach a state, some people like to call it the still point, in between emotions, in between all that activity, it's stillness. It's very peaceful. If you reach that place, eventually the self also starts to dissipate. And if you break down what the self actually is or is composed of, you'll find most of it is quite malleable. And so if the self disappears and it's just pure consciousness and you're watching the ocean, the experience of being one with the ocean is naturally going to come. The philosophy will lead us towards the idea that all of us have this nature within us. All of us have the ability to reach it.
Today's guest is Dr. Aldrich Chan, a clinical neuropsychologist, psychotherapist, and founder for the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness in Miami. He's also an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University, where he teaches at both the doctoral and master's level, and he's been practicing Taoist and Zen meditation for over a decade. Aldrich's incredible new work brings together something I haven't really seen before. He takes classical Taoism, the philosophy behind the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, and maps it against contemporary neuroscience and evolutionary psychology to ask a big question. How did we become so misaligned with nature? And what does the path back look like? In this conversation, we get into his theory of that misalignment, what's actually happening in the brain when we meditate, the Taoist concept for nothingness, flow states, how to work with uncertainty, and why play might be more important than most of us realize. This is a deep one, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. So, Aldrich, welcome to the FitMind Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
I'd love to start with you as a person. I think your path is extremely unusual. You were born in Canada, raised partly in Hong Kong and Seattle, and then grew up in Costa Rica. So now you're a clinical neuropsychologist in Miami, and you're practicing Taoist meditation. So how did all that come together?
It's a bit of a long journey, but I'll try and I keep it succinct. Um, my passion for the field began quite early on. All the way back in fourth grade, I remember a teacher giving us a project to learn about the brain, and everyone chose but different body parts. And as a friend of mine and I, we were talking about the brain, and we created a little mold of the brain and talked about it. I just remember being quite fascinated by it. And we can fast forward all the way to high school and undergrad, and I was always, really drawn to either electives that involved philosophy and psychology, or also, biology and neuroscience. And so initially, it was a little bit tilted towards philosophy, we could say, but I knew that after doing some volunteer work, that I really enjoyed working with people directly. And so what ended up happening was I chose the field of psychology. And during my master's program, I encountered the work of Lou Causalino and Dan Siegel from interpersonal neurobiology, and I found that Lou actually lived in California where I was doing my master's and taught at Pepperdine, and I knew it was a very good school for clinical psych, and so I applied, got in, and we ended up getting along very, very well. He became a mentor, colleague, and friend, and he introduced me to Dan and everyone else in that sort of family, and it really drew me into the field of interpersonal neurobiology. Now, neuropsychology is a bit more of it's a different discipline, actually. It's not entirely the same. One's more focused on therapy, the other is a little more on assessment. And I found that they complemented each other quite well for my level of interest. And for those viewing, and it sounded like you nodded when I mentioned, Dan Siegel, he's very interested in mindfulness. And basically, I learned a lot about, his book, The Mindful Therapist, and different mindfulness orientations, we might say, different types and practices. And I started really engaging very deeply. And one of my big pivoting points towards particularly Zen and Taoism was a trip that I made to China upon graduating from the master's program. And my goal was to hike the five sacred mountains of China. That was my big goal. And as I was, well, hiking them, I, ran into many Buddhist and Taoist temples and had all sorts of fantastic experiences. And all the while, I was voraciously consuming books related to Taoism and Zen. and I got really, really drawn into it. But as time goes on, I didn't have classes related necessarily to contemplative sciences and so forth, even though I was interested in that sort of field. And what ended up happening was I started focusing a little more on science, of course, with neuropsychology and mindfulness as it's been. I don't want to say appropriated. I guess I just said that, but by the West, but as it's used in the West, and I wanted to dive deeper into its origins. And I know that there's been tons of work already written on Buddhism, and I was always a big fan of the Tao Te Ching and Zhuangzi, and I didn't know that there was the Neya and also the Huainanzi, which are now also considered fundamental texts in Taoism. And so, after being steeped in Western intellectual traditions for a fair amount of time, I decided to start moving deeper into to Taoism and consulted with people from Brown University, who has a leading contemplative sciences program, and um, talked to a fair amount of people to learn and make sure that all my information on Taoism was accurate in the book. And it drew me in. And what was really striking to me is how compatible it was with the sciences. Specifically, Taoism as a philosophy. I know some Taoists don't like talking about Taoism as a philosophy because there's a lot of interchange with religious Taoism, but some people make the separation, and um, I'm only sticking with the 4 core texts. And I really do start off by sharing with everyone that I'm not trying to espouse a particular religion, but I think that the insights that can be gleaned from those fundamental texts are just so powerful. I mean, the Tao Te Ching is the second most translated text just behind the Bible. It's so old. It's over 3,000 years old, or 2,500 years, or whatever the case is. And in that context, there must be something fundamentally true about it. And so for me, exploring how Taoism resonated with neuropsychology as well as hunter-gatherer literature ended up becoming a great passion, and I ended up putting together this new book, The Seven Principles of Nature: How We Strayed and How We Return.
When you were going to hike the sacred mountains, was the scientific literature already was it already there to point to this kind of emerging field, I guess? Because it seems, at least more recently, if you look at like Matthew Sackett's lab at Harvard, that we're now starting to study the kind of deeper end of and what potentially what potentially is possible with these practices. And even just meditation science in general, I would say, is still quite new and in its infancy. So I was wondering, where was that at when you started to look at Taoism and Buddhism?
Yeah. It was, I believe, just lifting off, really. It was at that nascent stage in the West where it was just about to really blow up, but it wasn't
Mm.
quite there yet.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. I know it's incredibly excited. I've just become a little bit more involved in the kind of the researchers on LinkedIn, and it feels like it's just a very exciting time for for current research, and
Mhm.
it's moving faster and faster, which is amazing to see. You've developed something you call the SAD theory, so separation, alienation, discord.
Mm.
And the idea that over the last 2,500 years, we've been progressively straying away from nature in
Mm.
the structure of our minds.
Mhm.
So could you walk us through what each of those three stages means?
Yeah. And just because I now know the audience a little better from what you've described earlier, I will say that I already mentioned that there's a lot of convergence, right, between the what we're finding in the sciences and Taoist philosophy. And one of the major reasons why Taoism emerged actually was in reaction to the current political and philosophical climate. And one of the major things that you'll find in many of the texts is this straying from nature, right? And now we do also find that in evolutionary psychology, and that's in the form of mismatch theory. And let me just, I'll get back to that, but that's in the alienation phase. But I just thought it was worth mentioning that to begin this with. So the S separation likely began around, this is obviously a very broad theoretical assumption, but the oldest cave paintings are around 64,000 years ago or so. And it's a very important find because it shows when symbolic thinking began. And so, one of the networks of the brain that I studied scientifically is the default mode network. And alongside that are two other important networks. One's called the salience network, and the other is the central executive network. And so this the separation phase is how we became separated from this sort of flow of nature. How did we become creatures that not just are reacting to the world, but capable of responding to the world, right? And so I first approach it from this neuropsychological perspective because one of the fundamental functions of the DMN that's not really usually mentioned, alongside the central executive network, is their capacity to suspend the immediacy of space and time, or suspend the immediacy of experience. And when people say that sounds a little abstract, they say, well, how many times have you been in a conversation and your mind simply wandered, or you were daydreaming and then you were like, oh, what were you just talking about? Right? And well, what the DMN relates to daydreaming and reverie, and it relates to mental time travel and social cognition and self-reflection and all of these functions that we would engage in while we're daydreaming or when we're, reflecting upon certain experiences and and naturally so. And the central executive network is all about goal-directed action. And in order to act in a goal-directed way, we have to strategize. We also have to suspend the immediacy. And so this suspension of the present is that separation, is the way that I understand it. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people might think, oh, that's a bad thing because now we're no longer one with the universe, we might say, or at least we don't experience it that way because of the separation. But the separation was necessary for our survival, point one, which is why it likely evolved. And secondly, when we separate from the experience of the now, it well allows us to act in discord or in alienation with the natural flow, but it also allows us to act in harmony, right? So it's not a bad thing in that sense that it can be in harmony, just like an orchestra, just like a band that's playing together, right? But all the instruments are playing together and it sounds beautiful and it's wonderful. It goes together and it improves or increases the amount of creative expressions that can exist. Um, so that's the first phase is separation. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but it does sort of set the foundations for unfortunate things to happen. And so then we move on to the alienation phase. And this I'm going to bring back is more about mismatch theory than anything. And this is a pretty, um, well-known theory in the field of evolutionary psychology. And to put it very simply, the idea is that we have been, as a human species, hunter-gatherers for a much longer period of time than how we're existing today, right? 95%, some people say up to 99% of our time has been spent as hunter-gatherers. And that tiny fraction, that percentage of time that we've been living in these modern conditions is insufficient for, we can say, our biology to catch up. And so we are living in a time that we did not necessarily evolve to live in optimally. And so there's a mismatch between the conditions we evolved for and the conditions we currently exist in. And that's, to put it simply, what a mismatch theory is about. And so this is where it echoes, in Taoism, where in the Huainanzi, for example, there's lots of writings about what's natural and what's unnatural, and how by engaging in these unnatural things, we begin to become more and more alienated. So, as an example, in the book, I mentioned the agricultural revolution, right? Which they usually estimated circa 10,000 BCE. And what happened then is, well, we no longer needed to be mobile all the time. Now we have the ability to live in sedentary settlements, right? And conserve energy and farm. And all of these sorts of new tools and technologies started to emerge. And it sounded like a great idea, right? But in the instant that, not the instant that it happened, but what happened was that population started to grow, right? Because people weren't moving with the seasons as much and so forth. Well, it led to malnutrition. It led to spread of disease. When people lived in smaller groups of, let's say, Dunbar's number, 50, 150 or so forth, these numbers were more stable and it didn't allow as much competition. But now with greater populations, there's more competition and more stress, and none of this would have been really conceived of as the outcome of something that would have been so helpful to individuals. So I don't think it was in any way intentional. I think it was as a result of ignorance. And actually, I think the same thing is sort of happening with technology today, where it's beneficial in so many different ways, yet at the same time, we are just catching up with the consequences and learning how to better engage with it. But I won't go into that too deeply.
And before we jump any further, I just want to let you know that our amazing founder, my friend Liam McClintock's book, FitMind, has just released. I finally have a physical copy, and honestly, I cannot recommend it enough. This is genuinely incredible. He's somehow woven his story, which is absolutely fascinating, with both the contemplative science practice and the Western science. And it is just genuinely an incredibly unique book. You can order your copy right now at fitmind.org to support the mission and help elevate your mind. Thank you so much. And back to the episode. What is it we would notice, like in our bodies, to tell which of these we're in?
If mismatch is happening or not, you mean? Or,
Yeah, to say if we were in alienation
oh, I
or,
see.
or yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Is there
yes.
any like somatic feeling that would be tied to that?
One of the major feelings that and experiences that I'm trying to support in this research and as well as the work is our unity or connection with the natural world as well as the people around us. Right? We've and now we're touching on some of the principles, but you know, there are some major problems well, let me take one step back. There's some major categories that we know that or fairly confident that there are mismatches, right? And for example, one of them is social connection ultimately. Like people as hunter gatherers, they wake up and they're surrounded by friends and family at all times, and they're always together with them and so forth. And now while the internet is supposed to help us be more connected worldwide, people are feeling more isolated than ever, right? And it can lead to levels of depression. And we also have found in recent research that certain um, uh, hunter modern hunter gatherer ish, I'll say, societies that are transitioning to more of this modern world, they are experiencing an increase of depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses. So when you say, what how can you tell somatically, I think that feelings of anxiety or depression or isolation can all be part of this sort of mismatch experience that's ongoing. And that's a question that I'll likely be answering several times, I think, throughout our conversation. Actually, there's a lot more to it.
And this Discord, what could you say more about that?
Yeah. And so, while the alienation is about again the mismatch theory as well as historical events that may have supported the mismatch, Discord is now about the fundamental meaning systems that we've developed in reaction to the mismatch and other incongruences. So, the discord, for example, one of the major issues is separation of body and mind. I think that was a major, major problem. Um, and you might ask me why. And the reasoning behind that is number one, we know that the body is very much involved with emotions, with intelligence, with personality. I mean, this whole gut brain connection is very well known at this point and very well researched. In fact, there are more nerve endings moving from the gut to the brain than the brain to the gut. And I know that there's also some research looking at the heart and how that is also interacting and a center of intelligence, which, by the way, in Taoism, the three important areas include areas that are the brain and the heart and the gut, basically in those general regions. And so there's also some interesting congruences there in the Dantian. I don't want to, use too many words that might confuse people, but that's, it's a cool parallel to find. And so when people separate their body and mind, well, people tend to project all of their virtues and um, strengths to their mind, and then they sort of view the body as that which is depraved in some way. right? Whenever someone is gluttonous or someone is lustful or, doing something that they feel is violating their morality in some way, they say, oh, it's the body, right? And well, what does that lead to? It leads to a formula of perpetual discord, right? With oneself. No, you won't ever be happy, right? Because you live in a body and our mental actions are all realized through the expression of our body, right? So that's one great example I think of this principle of or the discord portion of the sad theory.
I haven't actually heard anybody connect the default mode network with time in the way that you just did. I'm kind of obsessed with the default mode network. Actually, I
Oh,
talk about it
okay.
probably way too much. But my teacher, my first Zen teacher, she used to say that when you meditate, she would be um in the hara, like the lower abdomen area, and just there, no teaching. And she would only really give you some reason for doing that, and that was just that every time you think, you're moving into time. And at first, when I heard that, I was quite, I think, somewhat confused.
Mm,
But you really are just moving into like all thinking is some perception that you're or some layer or higher layer of um movement into mind that takes you further away from now, just
mm,
literally.
yeah,
Um, and you're kind of, I guess, coming down the stack to put it in some sort of predictive processing terms,
right.
and you're reducing these kind of prediction errors that are these layers of thinking that are taking you further away from now.
Hmm. And you mentioned the hara, and we call it the lower in Taoism. It's the lower dantian, and the same thing when we're meditating, it's focusing on the lower dantian, and it keeps you in your body. It keeps you from, as you said, flowing off into time or flowing off into abstraction. And what's one of the major findings in people who are engaged in mindfulness-based meditations? Well, tends to be reduction of the DMN activity, which
Mhm.
makes complete sense.
That it's it's coming together. I think, yeah, conceptually, ironically, it's coming together quite well for me.
Mhm.
And there also is some evidence that the default mode network is correlated, as you mentioned, with anxiety, depression, and many of the other, at least hyperactivity or
Yeah,
overactivity in the default mode network
yeah.
has correlation. And then as you reduce it, the brain seems to become, I would say, a little bit more decentralized, which
Mhm.
in my mind it mimics better a natural system. Like, I feel like if you look at any natural system, it's quite distributed.
Mhm.
It and this is also, and I don't really wanna go too much into it, but it is also mimicked somewhat in psychedelic research that they because of the increase in experience, shall we say,
Mhm.
the assumption was that there would probably be increase in brain activity, which actually is the opposite of what seems to happen. There's actually a reduction in brain
Mhm.
activity.
Yeah, in certain areas and during certain phases, for sure. And I know it's been used as somewhat of an evidence for an idealist or objective idealist view of the world also, which is quite fascinating of an argument.
Yeah, I agree. Because even the first time I read that, it's just, well, it's kind of, it does make you wonder, but it's still a bit of a question mark there, I think. I would say the Tao Te Ching is probably, in terms of a book that seems to point towards the effects of meditation. I think for me, the Tao Te Ching is like I can open that book at any page and
Yeah.
read a very, very, for anyone that's not read it, it's essentially small paragraphs or phrases, and some of them might just be like 1 to 2 paragraphs, and it just seems to have an ability to be able to be read at any point
Mhm.
without reading necessarily in order, although I think that probably might still be recommended, and does seem to have an ability to reduce the layers of abstract thinking, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, abstract thinking is also viewed as a bit of the enemy in Taoism overall. Not all abstract thinking, that's a myth, but some abstract thinking that's related to clever and cunning is sort of the words that are typically used. And so it's not an anti-intellectual tradition in any way, I would say, except when it's towards, again, nefarious uses. So that's something important to consider.
So you talked a little bit about the brain networks, and there's another one, the subcortical midline structures that I'd love
Yeah.
to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, you describe it, I think, as the seat of our original nature, as a deeper
Mm,
layer underneath the storytelling self.
mm.
So, what's happening with this in the science and also experientially? How would you talk about it?
So the subcortical midline structures, this is a very theoretical concept that I'm putting out there. It doesn't have a very strong base, but my argument there is that if we had to find a representative for our original nature, it would be the subcortical midline structures. As you already mentioned, when people take psychedelics and they're feeling one with the world, or if you're meditating, you're feeling one with the world, the DMN starts to be inhibited. The central executive can also be quite inhibited. Many of the cortical regions are inhibited, and what remains fully active is the subcortical midline structures, right, which is involved with all sorts of, we can say, vital signals, or vital signs as well. um, and, for those of you who don't know what the subcortical midline structures are, it really, we could say that it involves the periaqueductal gray or the PAG and moves upward towards the midbrain. But, Peng Sep, in his research, an affective neuroscience, he no longer is with us. Um, but unfortunately, but he hypothesized that these regions were core to our emotional experiences as well, and that the seat of or at least where all of them tend to converge is this periaqueductal gray region. And so there's a lot of discussion about what the subcortical midline structures might contribute to, but based off of integrating those ideas, what came to mind was, well, the original nature. If we had to locate it in some way in the brain, then that would be probably our best guess at this point in time.
And for anyone that doesn't know what original nature is, or what the felt sense might be, how would you describe that?
I would describe it as this: that you know, due to the separation phase, we could say, um, and I would say more, many of us feel like we're isolated and housed in our own heads or minds, right? Like we all feel like I'm located up here, right? And that separation makes it feel like, well, I can deceive another person, for example, because they don't know what I'm thinking about. And it can lead to potentially antisocial behaviors. It could also lead to the exact opposite. But the experience of original nature, as described by lots of people, is experiences of timelessness, of selflessness. One of the major things that I would actually say is it helps us distinguish between the self and consciousness. And what I mean by that is that when people are in these sorts of states whereby they feel at one, or they're one, in Zhuangzi's words, we're one with the great unity. um, Usually people are still conscious of what's happening, even if their identity has somewhat dissipated, right? And so, at least for me, one of it gives us a nice sort of distinguishing factor between what the self is, which is, a first of all, a process that doesn't hold any real true weight, versus consciousness, which is constantly there in the background. And when the self dissolves and ego dissolution, what remains is consciousness. And I actually don't think there's that much that's too mystical about experiencing original nature from a meditative standpoint. Because, like, let's just imagine you're sitting down and you're looking at an ocean, right? You're watching an ocean, you're watching the waves, you're watching the horizon and the sun and the clouds, and you're meditating, right? And let's say your eyes are slightly open, right? And so you're meditating, your eyes are open, you're just, let's say, just focusing on your breath and releasing any thoughts, and any interactivity that's happening within you. And so what's going to happen eventually, it takes time, but eventually, you know, if you reach a state of some people like to call it the still point, right? That point where they're the point in between thoughts, in between emotions, in between all that activity. It's stillness. It's very peaceful, right? And if you reach that place, eventually the self also starts to dissipate because again, it is a process, and if you break down what the self actually is or is composed of, you'll find most of it is quite malleable and plastic. And so, if the self disappears and it's just pure consciousness, and you're watching the ocean, the experience of being one with the ocean is naturally going to come, right? So, it's a I think a nice way to sort of think about it. It doesn't need to be something so mystical or wow. It's something that will just naturally emerge, and I think that that's the a feeling that we likely all had at some point in our lives before the separation really emerged.
Yeah, I love that, and I agree. It's kind of funny that we do call it like original nature or true nature, and we are kind of or that's kind of saying that it's not mystical or anything um, out there or metaphysical or anything like that. But even I would fall victim to the perception that surely it's like surely it's something greater or something like that.
It's beautiful because it basically the philosophy will lead us towards the idea that all of us have this nature within us. All of us have the ability to reach it. It's our original nature, and so it's not like instead of this idea of needing to let's say build or create a self in some way. It's actually the exact opposite, where we actually discover the original nature. It's discovered rather than created, right? And I think that's a nice reframe and very hopeful and promising to lots of people who are suffering from all sorts of different ailments.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
And even the word oneness I find is sometimes confusing because one implies two, but I feel like the one is kind of pointed to like you could almost say nonness. I feel like might be
Numbness,
a better
yeah,
way to phrase it.
yeah. There's a Taoist researcher, Harold Roth, who I pulled a lot of information from, and he's also at Brown, and he formulated something. There's first person perspective, second person perspective, third person. He created something called the no person perspective.
Right.
That was interesting, and that's what it is. But one way, Josh, that I've been thinking about this also is that it's not necessarily maybe that the self is dissipated as much as perhaps that the boundaries have dissolved, and so it's integrated with something greater than itself. And that thing that is greater is just so much greater that the weight of the self and all of its troubles really starts to disappear, and it feels like it's dissipated when really it's just again the boundaries uh, have uh, have been changed or made transparent.
And when people hear things like this, like the usual question that will come up is, "How will I function?" What do you what do you have to say about that? Could you still function as a functional adult?
Yeah. So here's what I think with that. Um, I like to go to Jill Bolte Taylor, the neuroscientist who had a stroke in her left hemisphere, and she was only functioning on her right hemisphere for a period of time, right? Or largely so. And her descriptions were beautiful, and it was exactly the descriptions that people describe when they are in these transcendent states, right? The timelessness, the borderlessness, this feeling of connection with everything around oneself. It's just a beautiful experience, and you're right. When people get into these states, at least fully engaged in these states, how can anybody function? But I think it's not so much about that because um, well, because we have the DMN, and eventually we return to the DMN. The DMN may be altered in some way, but the separateness will still be there, but we'll just be closer to that nature so that we can still feel the unity within us, yet act accordingly, right? And perhaps someday in the future, when we all evolve in some hopeful direction, that we can activate these states more intentionally and more at will. I know that there was recently a study that came out with a lady who was capable of doing this, and literally just through meditation, and I'm trying to remember the name. Well, maybe we could put a post on that or something, but I don't quite remember. But basically, she's able to activate it on command, And so, like, she's under the scanner, and first she's kind of doing her own thing, and then she gets into the meditation, and they look at her brain activity, and it's almost identical to someone on a psychedelic. Like, it's really impressive, and there are certain people that can do that, and I think people who meditate more and more and have access to that dimension or of experience, will be able to carry it more greatly with them into their present lives, but not necessarily be absorbed by it, right? We're not going to become the primordial soup, as some people like to say.
Do you have any theories on why, like, meditation does look similar to psychedelics, yet there is no, uh, not to say there's no altered perception, but there's not like morphing fields of geometry or something like
Yeah,
that. Usually, I mean, there
yeah.
could be, but
I mean, there are lots of people who, who get into, who do meditation retreats and meditate hours and hours on end, and they do see hallucinations and all sorts of challenges that they face and all of these obstacles. But at the end of it, the psychedelic it's different than naturally induced states of self transcendence, right? I mean, you're taking a very strong substance that's acting on mainly 5-HT2A receptors and of course many others, but it has a life of its own, right? And so the difference between you know, an inner cultivated state of being versus a use of a substance. I mean, substances in general, they tend to be more intense, rapid, and pulsatile in experience for any drugs, right? We have endogenous, um, let's not using big words. We have, um, uh, we have natural highs and there are artificial highs. And the natural highs are, things like when you, well, have sex and have an orgasm, or when you are experiencing a moment of pride or a close connection with a friend, right? All of these release certain neurotransmitters. But, if you take LSD or take mushrooms or, if you take drugs that aren't so helpful, like let's say cocaine or something, right? Those will induce a complete different state. I know lots of people are fans of Alan Watts, and I love Alan Watts also. He's an intellectual entertainer. He's amazing, but I liked his how he described it, right? Where um, when it comes to the use of a psychedelic, a big difference is that it's like you're hopping on a pogo stick, and it lets you hop, 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 and you hop, and you can see over onto the other side and see, oh wow, this whole world exists. But eventually, you sort of come back down, right? You may retain qualities of meaningfulness and acceptance and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, again, we're not becoming absorbed by the other side. Whereas I think instead of hopping on a pogo stick when we meditate, we're creating more transparent boundaries.
mm, yeah, I like that. That's a beautiful way to put it. And there's two ideas that I'd love to spend a bit of time on. The first is nothingness in Taoism. That's not a void, which I feel I've heard that they need to. This was in regards to Buddhism, but they might need to rebrand it, which I find is quite funny. But
Yeah.
we could talk a little bit about that.
Mm.
So it would be like a fertile space of unlimited potential, and the second is the uncarved wood. So the idea that your true nature doesn't actually need optimizing. And both of these push back against, I guess, like modern self improvement culture. And for a meditator that already is like sitting regularly, um, what does it look like to practice like nothing with nothingness rather than trying to fill it? And what
Yeah.
would like living as uncarved wood, what would that look like for us in everyday life?
Yeah. So, Josh, you mind if I take one little step back before diving
Absolutely.
into that? Because that falls under the principle of creativity. And I just wanted to, put it into context. Um, so let me just mention what the seven principles are. I'll go back to creativity and then I'll dive into nothingness. Okay.
Please.
So, like I said, that chapter falls under creativity. So does the uncarved wood. We also, so that's the C, and actually it spells out the acronym CPR West, right? Which was a part of the reason for writing this book as well. And so we have creativity. The P is process. The R is relationship. The W is wholeness. The E is equilibrium. The S is spontaneity, and the T is transformation. And as far as I can tell, at every level from quantum all the way upwards, all of these principles apply. And so the paradigm for me is quite actually simple in the sense that, well, if we accept that creativity is a part of nature, and not creativity like you're a creative person, you're in the arts, it's more so the fact that we are in the constant act of being created and recreated over and over and over again. And in fact, what's in front of us is nothingness. And this is kind of trippy for some people, right? Where it's like, well, every single moment that passes by, we're just inching towards nothingness, but something is recreated again or created again or existing, right? And so it's this fascinating, like, I'm not going to fall into nothingness, but potential is continually being realized, right? And if we accept that change is a constant process, and for me, change is the action of creativity, then, well, we have to stop clinging on to things like identities that we no longer actually are serving us in any way. Some people are, thinking about the quote unquote the golden days, or they're unable to let go of who they used to be. And it just causes more suffering and they're stagnating, right? And for that is someone to me that is not aligned with the principle of creativity. Someone aligned with it is someone who would be more curious and open to the process of accepting uncertainty and change. So, so that said, we can go. I started with nothingness, and I think nothingness. I put it very early on because I think it's one of the things that really, like you said, sort of diverges from what Western thinking usually considers nothingness. And well, you already said it. Nothingness doesn't imply a void. It's better to be said as no thingness. And you've heard of that one, no-thingness, right? It's not a thing, it's not like a, you know, it's maybe something more abstract, or in my own metaphysics, it's an event, and events are composed of mental and physical processes that are constantly in a process, that are constantly dynamic and moving. And for Taoists, this fertile expanse of potentiality is what nothingness is. And, there are lots of ways to think about how useful nothingness can be, right? So, in the Tao Te Ching, and just building off of the statements that it makes, a cup is, why is it useful? It's useful because of the nothingness within it. Or a room, it's useful because of the nothingness here. And it kind of changes the way that you perceive even areas that you walk into, where if I look at architecture now, I'm not just looking at where things are. Oh, here's a window and here's a bell, and here's this amazing historical, I don't know, architecture. I think of how do they also position or how are the spaces within this place? Right. And sometimes it could bring such beauty. Like you walk in and some people say, oh, I feel claustrophobic here. That's the nothingness that's lacking, we could say, in the architecture. Um, so so Taoists, they like to approach it from a practical way. That's one practical way. And of course, well, I mean, do you have any thoughts or questions at this point? I don't want to go off on a rant.
No, I really like the emphasis on the space because I find that the things and like mental tension and even bodily tension through meditation or these practices, qigong, yoga, it does seem to reduce the kind of weighting. Like for me, it does feel quite physical, and people have a problem with this because there's not really a way to explain that. I think currently, but particularly like with head tension or like even objects outside of me, people, or if I do de-weight it, it feels like things are a little bit thinner and
Yeah,
everything just kind of flows a little bit better.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. One of the techniques that we typically use to improve psychological flexibility in the psychological sciences is, meditation where, for example, if you're feeling anxious, right? We can ask someone to sort of close their eyes and, what do we say? Make space for the anxiety within yourself, right? Imagine that the anxiety has a particular shape to it, right? And maybe say, oh, it's a triangle and it's pulsating and it's sort of moving, and it's like, oh, well, create more space for it and just observe it neutrally, without action, without judging it, without anything, without assigning it labels, and just watch and see if it transforms or changes. And a big goal of psychotherapy overall is increasing people's tolerance to suffering and holding ambiguity. And a big part of that is creating more space within oneself, becoming a larger container for these sorts of experiences. So it's also kind of an interesting intersection.
it really is. I've heard some people talk about like knots of like resistance or suffering as like an actual knot that if you observe closely, you might see. Usually
Mm.
it's very difficult to pinpoint any firm shape as everything's changing.
Right, right, and that's perfectly fine as well.
What other practices would you recommend? Do you practice qigong or do you have any moving practice in relation to
Yeah, I
Tao?
practice Tai Chi. Every morning I engage in Tai Chi exercises, and I also really enjoy the 108 form. So I like to do that sort of over and over again. It helps me get into greater flow states, and it feels good. It feels good to engage in body flow based movements like that. By the way, if we want to get into it with flow, you know, this concept of Wu Wei, right? Action. Some people call it action through inaction, or it's really effortless action is also another way to put it. But one of they've done some pretty interesting studies looking at flow also, where they would show, for example, someone who's so what's a profession where flow is quite common? It's musicians, right? So they put people like improv jazz pianists, and they would have them like play scales under a scanner, and then they would have them just improvise and get into a flow state. And they looked at what areas of the brain were active or deactivated, and well, lo and behold, similar to what we mentioned before, other than of course regions required to be active to be playing, and one area of the frontal lobes that's related with the observation of conflict monitoring, many other cortical regions were also silenced or shut down. And so again, what was likely very active is, well, the subcortical midline structures alongside, some other peripheral regions. And flow states are fascinating because they're universal. They're universal, and anything that's universal means it's been conserved through evolution, which means that it was considered important. And people might say, well, how can you say that me being effortful at something is going to be less beneficial for me than not being effortful? It's like, well, let's look at the people who are professionals. And I'm a musician also, so I play guitar and I've played live music. And as soon as I become conscious of what I'm doing, like I remember this one time I was playing a gig and I was playing a solo and I got into my own mind and I hit the wrong note at the very end of the solo, and I was like, "Oh, no," you know? But when you're in the flow state, much more likely to be more effective at what you're doing and more productive, and people who have more flow states report greater levels of well-being, and so there is a lot of evidence to support that these flow states are highly beneficial to productivity.
Yeah, I remember such a good point. And it's a scary. I remember reading Stephen Kotler's book. Um, I think it's Catching Fire or something fire. Anyway, but I think they reported like CEOs were having 800% increase in productivity when in flow,
Wow.
and that just basically the effects of modern technology, notifications, and because the ease of which you can be brought out of flow, and as you said, the correlation between happiness and flow. I think
Mhm,
the more flow you have, generally, the happier you are, at least in that context.
mhm.
And it's funny that reference is CEOs, but I guess that was the audience.
Right, right, yeah.
'Cause
Yeah,
you
go ahead.
will often hear these meditative states being like effortless flow, and I think that is akin to what we were describing before, and probably one of the best descriptions, or something that somebody maybe that hasn't meditated might understand.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. Yeah, meditation doesn't need to be just sitting down with your eyes closed or eyes open, but it could be moving. I know in Zen practice, there's walking meditation. In Tai Chi Qigong, there's standing meditation. There's all sorts of types, and even I think that from the lab of Amishi Jha, she finds that people who are meditating by just walking and just paying attention to their feet, they also show changes in their brain functioning that seem to be akin to changes that they find in mindfulness practices. So a big part of it is finding an anchor to the present and continually cultivating the practice.
Yeah, I love that. And how else would you recommend people to get into these states or to increase their chance of achieving flow?
Mm. Yeah, well, you know, the dark side of flow is video games. You've heard of this? Yeah. Video games are designed to basically induce flow states, which is why children can play nonstop. In Kotler's book, right, he has this sort of 4% rule. If you're functioning 4% high, like he says it's just a theoretical estimate, but whatever you're doing, if you want to engage in a flow state, do something that's 4% more difficult than what your current capabilities are,
Right.
right? And so, um, similarly, that's what video games do. You beat one level, it gets more challenging, and it gets to a point where it matches you, and it's just slightly more difficult, and it gets you right into that mood. But then it could become quite addictive in those sorts of circumstances. So your question, I gave a bad example. I don't want anyone to get addicted to video
I
games.
mean, it's an important example.
It's true though. It's true. That is a way to get into flow. But like I
Mm.
said, engaging in something that is intellectually stimulating and emotionally gratifying. It needs to be, it needs to have both components in order for flow to actually occur. And it can happen in really anything that you're doing if those, I think those components are very much engaged. There's also, of course, immediate feedback, and there's all these criterias, but I think those two are quite central to finding it.
I'd love to talk about stillness and the idea of eustress. Eustress.
Mm.
So that
Yeah.
not all stress is bad,
Mhm.
um, and that we're looking for, I guess, like some sort of dynamic set point rather than the absence of stress.
Yeah.
So the wellness conversation I keep swinging somewhere between burnout culture and stress is the enemy. So,
Yeah.
what would you say is the more accurate story? And then, practically, what's the difference between like productive stress and the kind that's actually pulling you out of alignment?
Yeah, great question. So first, this is the principle of equilibrium that we're at now. And the principle of equilibrium, a little deceptive because what I really speak about is a dynamic balance. So I'm a big believer, we could say, or thinker in regards to asymmetry being a little more important than symmetry, actually. Because if we think of complete static balance, then nothing's moving. But humans, we're always moving. We're always constantly on, if you get in a biological perspective, if you're hungry, you seek for food. If you're thirsty, you drink some water, right? You're a little off the homeostasis. It moves you, it gets you to do something. So, eustress is this sort of ideal proportion of stress that is actually helpful to you. So, most people don't understand that the stress system becomes active, whether you are the vulnerable gazelle that's being hunted by the tiger, or if you're the tiger that's hunting the gazelle. Both of them have a stress response, actually. And when we say that stress can be helpful, it's because, well, when we are mild to moderately stressed, it can be very conducive for learning and growth. Right now, you just said, what does that look like? How do you tell the difference? Well, for both of them, well, the stress system is active. So you do get this release of adrenaline, you do get a release of cortisol. Your heart might be racing a little bit. You might even have some sweat involved and other sorts of bodily expressions that are similar. The difference, though, with eustress is that you don't feel overwhelmed. You don't feel or think that you don't have the resources to handle the problem. You're confident in yourself, in your ability to handle what's in front of you, even with this reaction. And that would be eustress. The moment you start feeling overwhelmed, the moment you feel like I can't tackle this, is the moment it starts moving over from mild moderate to potentially, major, or I don't know, high moderate, or something that can be more detrimental to your health.
As a tip, I love the pointer to welcome any feeling of overwhelm. I find just immediately when I welcome a feeling, the space between me and it, I guess, is increased. And then the resilience or ability to change or
Mhm.
just move with some form of wisdom, I think is increased.
And what you just pointed to, Josh, is really important because the other part to this is if you find a way to face or confront what you initially considered as overwhelming and you viewed it from a different perspective and you, let's say, made space for it or whatnot, you can convert what you considered previously a major stressor to one that's mild or moderate, in which case you can convert it and make it actually productive to your well-being. But there are definite, and that happens a lot. That's a lot of what we do in psychotherapy with individuals, right? When they think that something is too great to handle, but they definitely have the ability to do so. And it's learning what the threshold is. And then there are times when the system is just not working for you. And you are overwhelmed and there is a reality to it. So that's also important to acknowledge.
Yeah, that's well put, actually. The I remember specifically on a on a retreat that I was on, I was thinking about asking a question to the teacher, and like public speaking, I would say is by far my number one
Mm,
fear. And I was watching the absolute terror in my body and doing the same thing, just welcoming it. And I recognized that the anxiety, the fear was what I would have considered it was excitement plus resistance.
Mm,
Like as I welcomed it, it just increased and it looked exactly the same. It felt exactly the same as excitement, but
mm,
previously there was just a bit of resistance. And then that was in that moment, it was just both combined that was
mhm.
creating anxiety.
And how did it come out, your question? Did you asked it eventually?
Yeah, the question came out good. I mean, the fear came back, and I was trying to stay as much as I could with the body,
Right.
but it was reduced.
Mm.
Like it's never the same. It's never the same. But I think I've probably spent, I don't know, 30 odd years pushing down the fear of or pushing down and not asking the question. So there's quite a bit of conditioning to undo that.
I mean, you and a lot of other people. Sure, it's always nerve-wracking, in a sense, you make yourself a little vulnerable when you ask a question, right? And also when you are extremely nervous, and I know it sounds like it didn't happen to you, but for some people who have speech terror, like you get so nervous that you ask a question and it didn't come out the way that you were thinking about it. Um, one of
That
the things
definitely happened.
well, in those situations, it's interesting, like from a brain perspective, usually when we're speaking, blood's flowing to an area in the left hemisphere called the Broca's area, which allows us to produce speech or at least permits or expresses. But what happens in speech terror is that the blood is rerouted and it doesn't get sent to that area and it gets sent over to your fight flight system, which then holds you
Wow.
back from being able to articulate clearly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense because yeah, it'll usually end up some condensed version of like you're just not getting across the key point or something like that.
Right. But hey, every time you do it, it gets easier and easier, so
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's such a good fear to get over. A lot of mine is in context. I don't know what it is about retreat, but I actually feel more fearful then than if I was
mm,
just in a room. I think it's the silence, like
mm,
the holding of silence, and then you're just one time a day speaking some questions and
right. Yeah. Well, Josh, you'd be a great psychoanalytic client. Where they use silence. Silence it can be used as an intervention.
yeah, right. Right. But what do you do for your practice or your practices? Have you got like a main teacher or what kind of stuff?
Well,
What
yeah.
practice?
There are a few things that I do. I am an obviously I'm a clinical neuropsychologist, which means I conduct assessments looking at basically drawing out a comprehensive cognitive profile, helping people identify what their strengths and weaknesses are, and that helps inform treatments and the best recommendations that they can have to live a fulfilling life, we could say. I also provide psychotherapeutic services, um, and then I do run a meditation practice. It's a small closed group with just 2 3 people at a time. I'm an adjunct professor for Pepperdine University. I'm teaching for doctoral students and master's level students, and recently just started a role with a neurofeedback company, um, which I guess I can't disclose it yet because the contract hasn't been fully signed. But I'm getting on as a senior science officer for them. It's about meditation and it has a Taoist uh, flow to it as well. So it's been really interesting. So yeah, those are all the things that I do, and I have the public education platform, and I love writing, of course, and so
Yeah, amazing. And what type of what's like a Taoist meditation or what would be one that you practice?
yeah, so I put a bunch of them in the book actually, um, and I also put scripts in there that people can follow along. For me, I like the simplest one. I've tried all the complicated ones where you visualize this and that, and at the end of the day, the easiest one for me is really stillness meditation, quiet sitting. And I basically connect align my mind with my body with my breath. And so when I connect my breath with my mind, every time I inhale, for example, I capture what I call nets, which are narratives, emotions, thoughts, and sensations, anything that's happening, and I just blow, like, I help facilitate them out as I breathe out. And it's just this continual act of filling and emptying, and eventually I get to that still point, and I like just remaining there for extended amounts of time. And so that's the one I really default to. And of course, I see Tai Chi as a meditation as well. And that's something that I also do quite a bit. But, beyond that, I love playing guitar and uh, playing.
Yeah, I'm constantly surprised by just well, I do qigong, which I think is quite similar to
Yeah,
Tai
quite
Chi,
adjacent. Yeah.
and it amazes me how much happier it makes you, like
Hmm.
spontaneously happy.
Hmm.
Which, yeah, my logical brain is like, how is this like how am I substantially like
Yeah.
during a meditation I might go that way, I might not, and I guess it doesn't matter. But qigong in particular has a real
Mhm.
ability to bring up my mood.
And you know what, Josh? I really think that seated meditation may not be for everyone. I think that, as what I said, I view the mind as part of the brain. But the body is part of the mind, right? And so some people need this movement, and that is one of the big mismatches. Also, is movement in evolutionary theory. Hunter gatherers, they're moving 14,500, 20,000 steps a day, and a modern American, at least, is moving about 4,500 steps a day. It's barely anything, and it leads to all sorts of problems. And so we need to increase step count. But qigong and these movement-based meditations, it's the complexity can add to that intellectual stimulation component that can just you know bring up the endorphins and all sorts of other uh, positive neurochemicals that can make you feel better.
If a listener was to take one thing from the conversation and build a daily habit around it for say a month or a week, what would you have them do, and what would you expect to shift? Anything specific, perhaps that's worked for you
Hmm.
or your clients, actually.
I mean, I think a very important part is that's a I feel like there's so many I can say. I think a very important one though is uncertainty, how people work with uncertainty, because it plays a role in everybody's life. And you know, there are different ways in which uncertainty can be confronted. One of the ways that usually people confront it is when they're presented with uncertainty, they go straight into threat detection mode. Their fight flight system is very active, and then their frontal lobes are looking for the threat and all these what if conditions, right? But that's just one way you can approach it. I think we can totally shift that attitude by inhabiting a different mode of experiencing, a process oriented mode, one where we're really looking at uncertainty as just information. It's information and energy. And when it is uncertainty, we can approach it from an exploratory perspective, right? And there are benefits to uncertainty as well. When we are uncertain, we become more alert. When we're uncertain, we engaged with the possibilities. And uncertainty, I always love this one where people say, well, certainty is the death of a question. Certainty is also the death of adventure, because without uncertainty, there is no adventure, no spontaneity and fun and in the life that we have to experience. And so it's really appreciating the uncertainty and inhabiting an intentional stance of uncertainty. And by doing so, it can really help you face uncertainty with far more confidence and comfort. One of the great popular stories that I love to share in relation to this is the a parable from the Huainanzi about the farmer and his horse. Have you heard this one, Josh?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you mind
Yeah,
if I
but
share
please
it with the
share.
audience? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So this is a paraphrase, of course. I'm not going to get it exactly right, but there's a farmer, and he and his family are famous diviners, right? They can predict the future. I'm giving you the legit story because there's also like other ways that people have described it and worded it. But okay, so there's a diviner and he's a farmer, and he has this beautiful horse, and this horse escapes one day, and the horse escapes, and everyone from the village runs over, and they're like, "Hey, we're so sorry to hear that your horse has ran away. You've lost such a prized possession." And he looks at them. He's like, "No, this will be a very fortunate event. This will be very fortunate, right?" And they're like scratching their heads, like, "What's going on? This guy is crazy." So they walk away. A week later, the horse comes back with 5 other horses, and so his stock's even greater now. The villagers stop by and they're like, "Hey, it's amazing. All these horses have come, and you have your beauty back." And the diviner looks at them and he's like, no, no, this is going to be very unfortunate. This is going to be very unfortunate. They left scratching their heads. What's he talking about? Right. A month in, the farmer's son is training one of these wild horses and gets thrown off the horse and breaks his leg. The villagers came by to express their sympathies. And again, he says, no, no, this will be very fortunate. This will be very fortunate. And then, a few months pass by and the son's leg is still broken and an army comes to recruit people. But because his son's leg is broken, he doesn't get recruited. And later on, they figure out that the battle he would have been recruited to, 9 out of 10 people died. And so the villagers stop by to share how fortunate he is, but he says, no, this will be very unfortunate. This will be very unfortunate. So it's a fantastic parable. And, there's a maybe version to this where he says, "Oh, maybe, and that could also be powerful." But I like this idea of, and it's one of the things it suggests in the Tao Te Ching is like when you're in times of peace, that's when you should really be training yourself to make sure that when times of war come, that you're very well prepared, right? Or you think further into the long run. This is the benefit of the default mode network, by the way, because it allows us to simulate future scenarios, right? I use the term motes to describe it for mental time travel, others, and the self for the functions of the DMN. And if we can simulate it in the future and think about all these possibilities and so forth, can we also use it to our benefit as opposed to just using it in a way that detracts from our experiential well being, right? Like, who knows? You just don't know that a tragedy that can occur can actually be beneficial in the future, right? And something beneficial can also be tragic. And so it's sort of maintaining this curious, process oriented, discovery oriented, you know, curious approach to the world. I think that that can be quite powerful if it's integrated appropriately.
I actually hadn't heard that version of the parable before, so thank you
Mm,
so much for sharing.
yeah, that's a little closer to the actual text. So
I wonder that would probably be one of the maybe perhaps the oldest iteration of the because it appears in other traditions too, is my
mhm,
understanding. That
mhm.
might be one of the older ones.
I'm sure. I mean, it's such an effective one, and it's gone through so
It
many
really
things.
is.
The Huainanzi is a compilation of all sorts of other texts, so I wouldn't be surprised if it came from something else. But that's the oldest version that I could find of it.
Yeah, amazing.
Mhm.
So the FitMind exists, I guess, to bridge the real science and traditional contemplative practices. Ideally kind of depth over reach and transformation over information. So, as someone that's doing both, where do you see that bridge being most like poorly built right now? And what are the well-intentioned mistakes?
Yeah. So I'm speaking uh, through the perspective of a neuropsychologist, and so that's where it's going to move forward in. And the final chapter of the book is really tackling this. And actually, we're currently working on a publication that's going to formalize my approach as something that can be useful. And I'm calling it the neurodynamic approach at this point in
Nice.
time. So one of the things that it does is that it reframes mental health conditions that some conditions, not all, but some conditions out there, a lot of them actually, but not all, need not be understood in a shameful way. They don't need to carry the stigma that they carry. And so instead of feeling shame, instead of feeling like there's something wrong with you, it's viewing it as you're misaligned with the principle of nature. There's nothing wrong with you. What we need to do is help you realign. So that's one, I think, very powerful perspective. If we go to mismatch theory, for example, one of the common cited cases for me that I bring up is ADHD. Some people who have ADHD, they feel dumber at school or they feel insecure and they feel like there's something wrong with their thinking. All their classmates are ahead of them. Firstly, you know, people with ADHD tend to have IQs that are relatively similar to their peers. It's just that their attention is poor. But the question is it poor or could we understand it differently? Because if we look back at our evolutionary history, ADHD could have been very beneficial in an unpredictable environment, right? And so if we have somebody, for example, lightning struck a tree and there's fire, is it the person that's going to be very controlled and conservative that's going to realize that they could, catch this fire onto another piece of wood and use it for cooking food? Or is it going to be the person who's stimulus bound that has problems, quote unquote, regulating their impulses, that's actually going to go up to and be like, oh, look, this is pretty cool. Let's try this out. It's probably the ADHD person, right? And so it's kind of I'm kind of confronting this deficit model where we're always focusing on the problems and not focusing on the potential strengths that may be involved, especially when viewed from that perspective. And these 7 principles that I came up with are all invitations. They're all invitations for different ways of being in the world, right? And these invitations, if you align with them, if you accept the invitation, as you accepted the invitation before asking the question, right? Um, they can really empower your capacity to survive and flourish in the world. And the word I like to use is potency, which is a word that's typically and frequently used throughout the Taoist literature. That you're no longer swimming against the current, but you're swimming with it, right? And so there's this potency moving forward. Um, uh, you're no longer how would I put this? Um, you're no longer crippled by uncertainty, but rather you're moving into it. You're playing with it. You're having a dance with it. You're facing a tragedy, and yeah, you'll feel emotions. Yeah, you'll feel sad. That's totally fine. Even Zhuangzi feels sad, but for how long is it necessary for you to engage in self-inflicted suffering, and can you accept it? And maybe something better might come along.
Yeah, I feel like you started to touch a little bit then on play. You talk a little
Mm,
bit about play,
yeah.
and how we can bring that back into our lives. Is
Yeah.
something I'm certainly missing.
Well, hopefully I can help out in some way. I think play is a very major, major system. Not just it's not just important for our well-being, but it's actually considered a primary emotional system in the work of Yak Pangsep. Because play, if you look at children playing, it helps them. They'll naturally form social hierarchies. It teaches them empathy because if you're being antisocial, you're gonna be left out of the group. There are many ways in which play leads to improved qualities. And let me ask you this: the best teachers that you've had, the best professors as an adult that you've met, and the most influential people, they tend to be people who are playful and can make you laugh, right? You remember the classes that the professor cracks jokes and you laugh and you enjoy it and it's stimulating, right? It's play is just uh, not just an emotional system, but an activity that we all must engage in that also brings out our true self, right? When we're playing, truly playing, we're spontaneous with each other, right? And if you remember, if you haven't played for a while, you may not remember too well, but as a child, how many timeless experiences playing with toys, right? Or playing with friends where like the time just like you don't know where it went, but you had such an amazing time and you were just completely yourself, right? Allowing your intuition to express itself and intuition, not just impulse. Impulse um, does not take context into consideration, whereas intuition does, right? And so with spontaneous play, it can benefit an individual in all those different ways.
I think play, now that I think about it as well, could often be you could remove some of the learning curve into flow because if you're doing well, it depends how difficult the challenge is, I guess.
Mm.
But but playing, anybody can play. At least I'm thinking in the context of a toy. You don't have to be a professional toy player to play with a toy.
Hey, I play cornhole with my friends sometimes, and I sometimes we get really into it, and sometimes I get into flow states just throwing the spear back and
My
forth into a hole. It can be in the simplest activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like yeah, the simple ones are so beautiful and fun. I think partly because of the barrier to entry being lower.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So you frame each of the principles as an invitation to a way of being rather than a rule.
yeah,
So
yeah.
if a listener could only accept one invitation this week, what which would you offer them?
This limitation is it's tough, Josh. Um, well, creativity invites psychological flexibility. That's what I've come up with. I think process invites attunement to the moment, a balance between immersion and perspective. Relationship invites compassion and alliance and connection with others. Wholeness invites integration and openness to perspectives. Equilibrium, I think, invites cultivation in the form of eustress. And spontaneity invites, well, playfulness. and intuition. And then transformation invites co-creation, co-discovery, committed action. And so I think all of them are very central, and they're all connected. I think that people listening, and I don't like to limit it, but people have different dispositions, and whatever calls out to you most, I think it would be beneficial for you to check out. And I also wrote the book in the form of a national park, so that there's a main entrance, and the main entrance is sort of reading the author's notes, and understanding what Taoism is and what it isn't. And then after the sort of sad theory, which if you've heard this podcast, you probably don't need to read it anyways, you can just jump around to whatever chapter calls out to you.
And for anyone that does want to go deeper on the book or to find more about you, your podcasts, your practice, and where should they find you?
Yeah. So my most popular account is Instagram right now, and it's at Dr. Aldrich Chan. And actually, it's the same um, for Facebook, and my website, and my YouTube also. And then my website is drchancnc.com.
Amazing. And what about the book? Is that's available everywhere?
All right.
We'll pop below.
Yeah, you could just look it up online, or it's sold in Amazon. But if you don't want to support Bezos, there are alternate ways that you can buy. Just search it online, and I'm sure you'll find it. And keep an eye out. The paper that we're working on now to formalize the approach is coming soon, and so that's also going to share more about how this can be more formally applied, with more practical tips.
I think it's a really important book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading, and yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, Aldrich.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. It was a great pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please, if you could give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell, that would really help us out. Or just share this episode with a friend, share the course with a friend. Anything would go such a long way. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.